you have enjoyed your Christmas edition of the KuriusHacks Game Jam so far. And today we're going to be taking some time, um, away from game jamming to talk a little bit about interior design, specifically in regards to game development and how you can enhance your game environments doing so. So, if you have any questions about anything in regards to what I talk about or just me in general, feel free to just ask them in the workshop channel and I will get to it when possible. Without further ado, let's begin with a small introduction of who I am. So, my name is Stef, and I am an artist slash game developer slash game development professor. I have been into games since, I don't know, prior to being in elementary school. It's always been a passion of mine. And since like the second grade, I had always told myself, I want to be in the game development industry. I want to contribute to the art form that is games. And some 15 years later, I was able to achieve that. After graduating from high school, I decided to enroll in the game development program at Algonquin College in 2016. And after 3 years spent there, I graduated with an advanced diploma in game development. And here in this very dimly lit photo, you can see me along with two of my pals and the game that I created for my third year project, Fallen Knight. After graduating from Algonquin, I spent a year volunteering at Algonquin, working in their simulations lab, where I helped develop simulation programs for use in VR applications for clients such as the Canadian Aviation Museum, as well as just the campus itself on some projects I cannot reveal, unfortunately. That was later cut short due to COVID, in which I spent a year just doing some freelance work and working on some side projects until I began my teaching career at Algonquin once again in January of 2021, teaching second year students the basics of architectural modeling and third year students on the basics of character modeling. So that's essentially my resume. Aside from that, in my spare time, I do enjoy gaming. I am quite the cinephile, so I love watching films and just doing digital art of my own, particularly character art, environmental art, even a little bit of programming when I'm a little burnt out on making things. So yeah, to carry on, since I think it's always nice to get a background of one's tastes and interests. As I mentioned, I am an avid gamer, of course, as well as a film viewer, and it's had a very large impact on how I develop games and my art in general. In regards to films, I've always had a penchant for strange, experimental cult films, as well as horror films, which you will see reflected when I begin talking about my catalog. And as for games, I like to consider myself fairly eclectic when it comes to my tastes. Again, horror is a very large proponent of what I play, but I'm also a very big fan of independent games, games that are very difficult, as well as very experimental and out the box approaches to game design. So to build upon that, I'm just going to give a short description of the timeline in regards to my gameography, if you will. Just a quick summary of the work that I've done, just so you guys have a better idea of where I'm coming from in regards to my game development experience. Shortly after graduating from Algonquin, I started working on a game titled Exit Mask, which was a very short, 30-minute psychological horror game with inspiration taken from my experience with obsessive thought patterns and compulsions. This was, I guess, a way to cope with the feelings I had been having and to turn it into something constructive that other people could experience. And overall, it was a very fulfilling experience. Got a decent bit of coverage after uploading it to itch.io, and most people seemed to like it, and making it was a very insightful and fulfilling experience. Even though it's a bit rougher compared to my later works, it still holds a very special place in my heart as a result of where it came from. Afterwards, a couple months later, I began working on a short Silent Hill inspired horror game with some of my colleagues from Algonquin, which I met either during my school years or my time at the simulations lab, titled Zimzoom, which is at the moment just a demo, but is a short horror game that takes place in an office building that is multi-dimensional and features all kinds of strange creatures. With inspiration taken from PlayStation 1 horror games, as well as the Lovecraftian mythos, amongst other surreal filmmakers and game developers and authors. This was a really fun uh, game to work on, especially with other people. It's significantly less stressful than working as a solo dev. And yeah, it was a nice little stepping stone in what I would make afterwards, which is Cookies, my second solo project. One I won't be covering too much right now because we will be getting back to it for the presentation. But in short, Cookies is a narrative driven horror game that takes place in a really seedy apartment block in Florida where you play as a down on his luck drug dealer. Much like Zimzoom, this game also takes inspiration from the PlayStation 1's hardware quirks, as well as VHS horror films and PlayStation 1 horror games. It's a really strange little game that involves like item trading and exploration, boss fights, and all kinds of really weird characters. It's a very bizarre, obscene game. And I'll just leave it at that for now because we're going to come back to it. But after working on games like that, one thing that I came to the conclusion is that probably my favorite part of making a game is populating its environment, making the spaces that you craft for your players feel like something special. For that brief moment that you are playing your game, you are fully immersed and feel like you are where you need to be in the game. Which is why I find environmental art, or in this case, the interior decorating of your spaces, to be so fulfilling. It really kind of makes the turning point from your game being like a 3D space and a game engine to an actual location where characters live and breathe and die. And I was really excited to be able to make a short talk in regards to those topics. So now that you know a little bit more about myself and where I come from in regards to game development and game art, we can begin talking about the actual specifics of interior decorating in games. First, we need to describe what it means to actually decorate a level. And something I'm going to do to explain that is borrow some terminology from film as well as theater. Uh, Sometimes, depending on who you talk to, the aspect of environmental art that refers to decorating a digital space is referred to as set dressing. This is because prior to games and maybe even prior to television, in theatrical performances, you would have the stage and the actors and the costumes. But of course, to make your play more believable, you had to actually set the stage, quite literally, with props and decorations to make the viewers believe what they were seeing, even though they knew it was on a stage. This, of course, carried over to film, where you have people who are prop artists, people who work on set designs and such. And now that games are much more advanced and capable of telling such engrossing stories, the art has transferred over to game development as well. But before I go back to the games, I'll direct some attention to the examples here, both from stop motion films, Fantastic Mr. Fox, and Paranorman. You can see when not looking through the actual lens of the camera, the spaces for these films are actual physical spaces with little props that were made by people and placed by hand to give the effect of whatever the space wanted to do. And while it is a little bit different for games because you don't have physical props that you are making by hand, you are still creating things and placing them to achieve a desired effect. The effect in this case, it varies completely depending on the purpose of the space in general. But usually you put a lot of time into placing props and decorations everywhere to establish a tone, but more importantly, an appearance. It makes a lot of sense and is kind of obvious when I say it out loud. But if you want something to look like a specific area, you have to put in the time so that it looks like that. So that is what set dressing is, and is what you do when you decorate the interior of your games. Essentially, to decorate a level, it's placing props, obviously, just adding them in general, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that. It is how they are placed specifically, which we will cover a little bit more in depth later on. Now that I've given a short spiel about what it is to set dress a level, we're going to clear up some semantics in regards to what level design is versus environmental art, especially because there are potentially some beginners here. It's important to note the distinctions because it's something that some people tend to confuse, which is okay. Now, I will say before I go into the contents of this slide, don't take absolutely everything I say as gospel because different studios, different teams, different individuals all have different definitions of what it means to be a designer versus an artist. And none of them are completely right or completely wrong. Like there's multiple interpretations. But just know that sometimes, depending on who you talk to, these can bleed into each other. So just keep that in mind. But anyways, in my opinion, a level designer is the equivalent of a digital architect in that they're not so much building like a house, for example, but rather they're the ones who sketch out the blueprints. They decide what the dimensions of a building are going to be. They decide where entrances are, how things connect to make a space livable. And in this case, for a game architect, like someone designing a level, they create the spaces with gameplay intent in mind. What I mean by that is, because presumably you have quite a few mechanics in your game. If we go with a really, really basic example, maybe a jump, a crouch, and a slide. As a level designer, your job isn't so much to make the level look good, you're just trying to get the bare idea of the level's layout set up. If we want this player to be able to jump a lot, we need to give the player opportunities to do that. Are there lots of opportunities for jumping? Are the gaps too high? Does it actually provide any benefit to take a higher ground? Are there places to crouch? Are there sections that actually motivate the player to do that? These are all things that should cross a player's mind. If you've ever played a really well-designed level, such as I think it was Celeste in one of my first few slides, games like that where they really force you to use the mechanics given to you, that is what a level designer does. They're not so much occupied with the look, but more so the function of it. For designing a level, I won't say that it's completely unartistic though, because that is not true. They employ lots of photography and filming techniques, such as perspective, lines of sight, the rule of thirds, because even though it's not supposed to be pretty, it still needs to be functional. If you take a look at the examples here, which are all from AAA games, this is what is known as gray blocking, which is when environments are given a very, very rough outline with typically gray blocks, just so that the player knows that what they're doing works. And you can see in this God of War example here, even though it's not pretty at the moment, everything that you need to see is visible. The campfire, the shed here, the shed here. There's a very clear line of sight. If you were to take a look at these examples here, you could probably play through this level properly by testing out whether things can be climbable, or in this case, with Titanfall, whether you can wall jump or if things are easily accessible, etc. That is the core of level design. And before I move on to the next slide, I'll also add that they're responsible for things like events and triggers in games. That is also something that they're responsible for, as well as maintaining the flow of the game. So trying to make sure that things don't get too difficult or too easy at any point when the player is traversing their level. On the other hand, environmental art is more concerned with the aesthetics. They're the ones who actually create the props, the structures, the little details that you see in a level itself. They're the ones who create them through the process of modeling, sculpting, texturing. If you're not too familiar with what sculpting or texturing or something like UV unwrapping is, it's not super important for this presentation. But in general, they're the ones who take a piece of concept art and turn it into a 3D model. That is what their job is. As opposed to, when it comes to actually placing the props, that might be the level designer's job. It kind of depends. But the actual creation, that is what an artist does. Typically, it's more of a collaborative effort, honestly. But by the end of a game development cycle, if done successfully when collaborating with the designers and artists, a really bland-looking gray block level that works can then be translated into a very nice environment that you can immerse yourself in that still looks believable while also being functional. So there's the distinction between the two. And again, like I said, they sometimes tend to blend in. But that's my best idea of a definition right there. So now with that out of the way, I'm going to give a couple examples of what I think are very effective instances of interior decorating in AAA games as well as in some indie games, starting off with Resident Evil 7. If you've played this game, then you've probably remembered this location. It's one of the first major locations in the game in that it is a abandoned house in the middle of a Louisiana swamp ran by mutant cannibals. And it is disgusting. But the reason why it's so disgusting is because the artists successfully were able to create a space that is just really, really gross and properly replicates what would happen if you lived in a rural community and did not take care of anything whatsoever. You can practically smell the house from this image because of how detailed it is, from the dirty plates piled everywhere to the floor and the wall that are clearly falling apart to the signs of neglect in the kitchen. Everything here just does a great job of showing to the player that this is a nasty, dilapidated house. In a much more clean example, we have a game like Hitman 3, specifically the level in England, if I'm not mistaken, which, while not as chaotic as the Baker House from Resident Evil 7, still does a fantastic job of conveying that this is a very high-class mansion with many years of history behind it. There's tons of decor everywhere along the tables, lots of artifacts all over the desks. This really does make you feel like it is a properly furnished house that people actually live in and have lived in for potentially centuries. Now, while those examples are great, I can understand, especially if you're a beginner, why they would feel really intimidating. Because one, your art may not be to the standards of a AAA game like this, and on top of that, you probably aren't even capable of making something this big if you're just a one-man team, unless you have your entire life ahead of you. But that's why interior decorating can still be used even if the assets you're making aren't incredibly detailed and made to look photorealistic. Because it's not just about art style, it's or it's not just about like the fidelity of your art style, but rather the placement and the composition of your assets. Case in point, High Hell, a game that I am very, very fond of. Compared to the prior examples, the art in this game is very, very simple. Geometry is not that complex. For textures, it's basically just solid colors. And still, these spaces are quite cozy. You don't get to see them very often because you're running through this game at breakneck speeds. But the spaces that you do inhabit feel lived in. It does feel like you're in an evil corporation run by monkeys and demons. Uh, there's not that many different props here as you can see from the screenshots I've shown, but just a bit of thought put into the placement and the organization of the props goes a very long way for creating spaces, even if they're very simple like this. And lastly, just in case anybody is a pixel artist, while I'm not going to be covering 2D games all that much in this presentation, I will show that yes, even in a 2D game that uses pixel art that's relatively low detail, the placement of props is still crucial for establishing a tone and just a general layout of the environment, such as in Hotline Miami 1 and 2. Again, it's not as detailed as the other games, but you can see here that proper placement and proper detailing can go a long way in creating nice, believable environments. So now that I've shown some examples, I'll go into why it's important to take the time to decorate your spaces. The most obvious one is most likely environmental storytelling. While dialogue and voice acting and script writing are all very important aspects for a game, if you want them to be, it's a bit exhausting to explain everything through text. There are instances where you want to show and not tell, which is why environmental storytelling is so crucial. I use the game 30 Flights of Loving as an example. For those unfamiliar, 30 Flights of Loving is a 15-minute video game with no dialogue and not much gameplay. It's, I guess, a quote unquote walking simulator about a bank robbery gone wrong. Except the game shows everything except the robbery itself. So it shows the planning, everything leading up to the robbery, as well as the aftermath, but not the actual robbery itself. And it conveys all of the information and it helps you infer what happens based on its set design. Now, if I didn't tell you that the game was about a robbery, you could probably take a guess based on this screenshot here, because you can see there are props placed to convey that idea. You have guns, you have diagrams here, you have blueprints. It is an incredibly simple looking game compared to The Last of Us, for example, but it still gets the idea across. So that's one of the reasons why decorating your space is important. When I say realistic, which I will say quite a bit in this presentation, I don't mean 4K textures, ray tracing, bump and normal maps, and all that. I'm talking more about how it's placed. So just keep that in mind. With that said, with an example like The Last of Us Part 2, it's important for interior decorating because it makes your characters and your setting really believable. Uh, while our imagination is great, sometimes if things just don't look the part, then the effect is lost on us. If we take a look at Ellie's room here, you can tell that it's kind of a makeshift room, probably because it's in a garage. And even though I don't know much about Ellie because I haven't actually played this game, if I were to walk around here a little bit, I could probably get a decent idea of who she is as a person. I can see she has some posters, some books, maybe something indicative of her hobbies. And for a game as character driven as The Last of Us, these tiny details are very, very important. So that is, once again, another reason. If we go to The Witcher 3, below it, one of the reasons why the placement of assets for interior decorating is so important is because it kind of fills gaps that our brain expects to see. This is one of those things where if you do it properly, nobody will really notice and say anything. But if you don't do it, people will notice and probably comment. Case in point, these really large tables in this banquet hall here. Typically, tables have food sitting on them, especially in a banquet hall. And if they're very large lawn tables with nothing on them, that's really, really going to stand out. With the fact that like all of the food is on the table, kind of makes it blend in more, even though there is a lot to look at. But without all of the food here to look at, it actually makes it stand out much more. So sometimes our brain, I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I can't really explain brain patterns, but we just expect some things to be there because of what their purpose is. Again, it's very rare to walk into a huge room and have completely empty tables. I mean, I don't think there's an empty table in any of these screenshots here. So it's important to be consistent with that. And lastly, it humanizes the level design implementations. And what I mean by that is, like I said, when you design a level, it's not supposed to be pretty. It's supposed to be technically sound. It's supposed to work in regards to your game mechanics. And while that's good in a gameplay perspective, it doesn't look all that good, right? You want to actually convert your 3D space into something believable, like an environment that people actually live in, as opposed to a testing ground that the player can just run amok in. So taking the time to really uh, flesh out your spaces will convey to your player that this is indeed a building that serves a purpose in its environment. It isn't just a series of jumps and skill gates and combat encounters and such. So going back to my solo game, Cookies, interior decorating was incredibly important because my game, there isn't that much gameplay. I mean, you can interact with NPCs, you can fire guns, and there are boss fights, but honestly, that's not really the main draw of the game, in my opinion, but rather the atmosphere and the environments that you traverse. I put a lot of work into creating these detailed environments that make the player feel really gross, that make the player feel like they shouldn't be here, and that they're just surrounded by squalor and poverty and desperation no matter where they turn to. So the process of creating these detailed game environments was incredibly crucial because I had to make it believable, especially with a not realistic game style such as the PlayStation 1 aesthetic. And I will be going back to this and talking about specific techniques I used to make the environment just a little bit more polished, I guess we'll say. But now that we have the general theory behind interior decorating out of the way, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth to my workflow for tackling how to populate a level. I will say this, I don't go into the process of how to actually model the props. Like that's a whole other beast. But more so, what I'm about to talk about involves like what you do once the props are made. Now, before you go about creating an environment, it's always important to create what I call a profile for it. That's just asking a lot of questions about the space that you are trying to provide because it will guide you in actually furnishing it. Quite a few questions you can ask involve the time period. That's an obvious one because you kind of need to know when the game takes place. You need to know what the purpose of the room is. Not so much from a like narrative perspective, though maybe that is important, but rather just in the context of the environment itself. What is the purpose of it? Is it a storage room? Is it a is it like a kitchen? Is it a really messy bedroom? You know, I don't know. It could be anything really, but you need to know. Otherwise, you will be aimless in trying to furnish it. You also need to know the location. Uh, Obviously, the location can be uh, incredibly important for how you go about not only creating the assets for a space, but also placing them. But also it makes sure that you are culturally accurate, especially if you make a game in a part of the world you may not be as familiar with, it's important to know where things are because that will heavily dictate the props that go into your decorating. The kind of people that live there, this is important because if you want to do a little bit of environmental storytelling in regards to the purpose of your rooms, it's important to know what your characters are because then you'll be much more able to reflect your characters through your plot props. And what else? Themes and tone. Tone being like, what do you want the player to feel like when they enter here? Is it happy? Is it sad? Is it chaotic? Is it really gross in my case, in my game? And what kind of themes do you want present in the room? If you're making a game about, I don't know, a revenge story, for example, and you enter a room where there's someone that's incredibly obsessed with catching someone that they're trying to get revenge on, maybe developing a room in that it's incredibly disorganized, chaotic, with notes hanging all over the walls and floor and props that indicate, I don't know, poor health, like say fast food, garbage littered all over the place. That could convey the idea of, say, revenge being, like a rabbit hole you don't want to go down. That's just an idea I came up with off the top of my head. But if there's a certain idea you want to convey, that is also important when it comes to determining what you want to work on for your decorating. So I created a very small example. I was intending on actually modeling the scene itself, but I was just a little too busy with everything going on over the past couple weeks. But regardless, I think the example here is paints a decent picture of how to tackle setting up an environment. The first thing I like to do before I actually do begin to model anything for my scenes is to create an organized asset list. Essentially, an organized asset list takes all of the assets that you have brainstormed for an environment and separates them into tiers. And I will explain what those tiers do in just a moment. So, whether you are an artist working on a team and your director says, hey, I want to make a Chinese restaurant, I want all of these things to be in there, it can be a bit intimidating because this is a really, really big list, and it's kind of hard to picture going about creating and placing these props when it's just all of them thrown at you like this. But say you're working alone, and instead of answering to somebody, you instead have, I guess, just you brainstorming. Again, this can be kind of um, overwhelming. Before creating this exercise, I was just spitballing ideas for making a Chinese restaurant. I made a list of all these props here. And then I decided, okay, I mean, this is a lot, but it kind of is really hard to like pick a starting point, which is where the organized asset list comes in. I'll explain the specifics in the next slide. So as you can see here, I've taken all the props from the first list and I organize them into separate tiers. And the purpose for that is to get a better understanding of what the different props will do once they're in my game engine. What is the purpose they serve? And by doing that, I like to use what I call a tier system. Now, I don't recommend like searching up like, asset tiers for game modeling because that's not an official thing. It's just kind of terminology I created to better explain my process. But essentially, when it comes to planning out an environment and modeling out assets, I split them into three different tiers. We have tier 1, which is considered the bare necessities that your space requires. If you strip back all of the decorations for just a moment and you pretend to walk into your game environment after it's just been constructed and the contractors have left, this is what the props are. Things like tables, chairs, maybe a counter where you can order food, the menu screens itself, fridge, oven, just the really, really basic things in the context of a Chinese restaurant. Typically, they tend to be very large and not as detailed because of how big they are. And the reason that they're so simple typically is because they're going to be decorated by the tier 2 and the tier 3 assets. So just by splitting them up into a list like this, you already have your very base elements that you can start with. And afterwards, once you have your base elements, it's much easier to decide, okay, what are some things that will decorate this space to accompany these assets here? Moving forward, we have our tier 2 assets. These assets tend to be a little bit more, I don't think interesting is the right word. Decorative would probably be more appropriate. These are quite literally the decorations of your game environment. They can also just be assets that aren't like super cool to look at, like a cash register, but they do appear once or twice and are made for accompanying your tier 1 assets. Something like a counter or a table. That's where a cash register would be appropriate. But you also have things like plants. In the case of the restaurant, maybe some dragon statues, a Buddha statue, things like, I don't know, Chinese calendars, posters, lanterns, things that are very colorful and actually catch your attention. They tend not to be repeated as often just because of how distinct they are, but they can be placed a bit, such as having a couple plants in some areas. And because they tend to be a little bit more detailed, their texturing is a little bit more high quality and a little bit more effort is placed into the actual modeling. And lastly, we have our tier 3 assets. These are what I consider the glue that kind of ties everything together, because you have your really big basic assets, you have your nice decor, but these are usually what determines whether a space will feel lived in or kind of hollowed out. Tier 3 assets are the simplest, both geometrically, like the models are never super complex, and on top of that, they're not super exciting. They're usually meant to be assets that you would just expect to find all over the place in a setting. In this case, the restaurant. Things like napkin dispensers, condiment bottles, plates, cutlery, milk crates, Chinese delivery boxes, just everything that you would expect to see all over the place that wouldn't look out of place if it was repeated. I can't say I've ever been into a restaurant that only has a single bottle of soy sauce. You'll see that all over the place. You'll see it on tables, a few behind the counter, maybe a couple lying around in the kitchen. And it's little details like that that you get from the tier 3 assets that really sells an environment. And you will see that in my examples very shortly. And just to hammer home the idea of why tier 3 assets are very important, we have here a donut from the program Blender. Anybody who's familiar with Blender knows that this is essentially the hello world of Blender modeling, and I must say it looks very, very nice. Fortunately, this is not something you would ever see in a game. The reason for this is because while this looks beautiful, it's just way too detailed to be useful in a game engine itself. Eh, while there are a lot of things that should be detailed and very high quality in your game, the fact is that game development is an uphill battle. You are always working against technical limitations, not only on the engine, but the technical limitations of all the people that are going to be playing your game. This sounds kind of sad, but what I'm trying to get at here is that this kind of gives you the opportunity to be a little bit lazy. Now, the point, like the segue for this, is that people were asking me, like, Steph, I know that your game is a PS1 inspired game. Obviously, it's not super high fidelity, but still, how did you manage to crank out so many assets for your game environments? And that's because I knew when it was important to add detail and when it was appropriate to just make something look just okay. Because again, while it'd be lovely if every single model in games were super crisp and super high poly, again, it's not just feasible. I show an example here in the Yakuza section of my game. There is a table in a dojo which has all kinds of food strung about, like sushi, miso soup, all kinds of different rice dishes. And if you take a decent look here, it may be hard to see, but these models are actually really, really simple. I don't think there's a single model here that is more than 200 polygons. And I honestly, if you were to really, really zoom in, you could tell they're kind of okay looking at best. But that doesn't matter because when you put them all together here, it's okay. Very rarely do you have people who will zone in on a very single asset and be like, oh, yeah, that's kind of rough. I mean, I do it because I'm a bit of an art nerd, but chances are if you play a AAA game in a packed setting, uh, you won't really notice it. It all just kind of comes together. Typically, when it comes to effective game environments, your assets are more than the sum of their parts. Another example here is in the player's drug lab. We have some really low poly bags of marijuana, fentanyl, and codeine that are really low res. But when put together, organized in a realistic way that you'd expect from an unorganized drug dealer, it just works, honestly. Again, I couldn't really explain the thought process behind why our brains just like the look of things all together in unison, but that is the case. And you might say, okay, Steph, that's great, but again, you're working on a PlayStation game. Surely, if I was doing something a little bit more high res, I couldn't get away with just making low detail props to reduce my workload. And you would be wrong. So I got these screenshots from a Twitter account called Low Poly Video Game Foods. They're great. And I've shown quite a few examples here of games that are pretty well known for their environmental design. And you can see they cut corners as well. Genshin Impact, this is supposed to be a piece of chicken, I think. And I mean, yeah, it's okay. These are grapes from the newest expansion of Final Fantasy, which made the rounds on Twitter. This did not age well because I think they have changed it within the past week because of the reception. But prior to that, if you got really, really close to the grapes, you would see they're like, I don't know, 10 polygons. Same thing with the rats from The Last of Us. They're kind of crusty looking. Uh, the burgers from Watch Dogs 2 are really, really uh, blurry with textures. Uh, the cereal from Grand Theft Auto is just a flat image of cereal on top of a sphere. And same thing with the noodles from Apex. Point is, um, you work with what you got. If you have a very nice laid out environment, it's not a sin to just put a little bit less effort into some of your props because, again, looking at the full picture, you never notice just the single assets. It's everything that comes together. Like if I were to zoom out of this picture, like far away, I'm sure this vineyard would look amazing with all of the leaves and the rows of grapes and the vineyard house and the ground textures. It all just kind of comes together. So let that be a lesson that it is okay to be a little bit lazy sometimes. We're only human, and if we were to spend our days making, 100,000 polygon assets for every single prop, games would never be finished. So it's important to know when to, uh, go all out on a model and when to just rein it in a little bit. On top of that, we have ways to populate your game environment while adding a lot of variation in ways that are not that difficult. First, we have palette swaps. If you're not familiar with what a palette swap is, it's just changing the texture or the color of something. For example, bookshelves are really, really easy to populate because, I mean, only books are on there really. So you can get away with just copying the same book over and over again with some very minor changes. Obviously, not every single book is the same size or the same color, but just, if this were me, for example, I would take this book model right here. I would clone it out in my program of choice. I would make it just a little bit taller, maybe a little bit wider, and then slap a different book spine texture on top of it. And then make another one that's maybe a little bit smaller, maybe a bit thinner, and slap another texture. There's probably 15 or so book textures on here that a dedicated texture artist probably worked on. But it's kind of hard to see from here, but the actual insides of the books all have the exact same texture. And it's okay because, well, they're books. It's really not that big of a deal. Just by making a few minor changes to the props here, you're able to make, I don't know, 20 books if you had the manpower that Bethesda has, and that goes a long way into populating something like a shelf. We also have another example here, the remake of the first Yakuza game, in which we have a very, very clean looking corner store. Maybe a little too clean for my taste, but you can see they used the whole easy variation idea to excellent effect. I have no doubt that all of these different ramen cups are the exact same model with probably just a texture change, and you can see that for all of the products here. I want to say there's maybe uh, 30 base models with numerous variations that the developers use to populate the entire store, and it just works. So when you're able to modify something on the surface, using just like a different texture, that can go a long way. I know that when I'm working on some scenes, if I'll have like, I don't know, beer bottles, I'll keep the brand as the same, and then I'll just change the color so it looks like different flavors of soda pop, which actually goes a long way into adding a lot of variation. On top of that, we have asset states. This is a little bit more different than palette swaps because you do alter the geometry itself, but it is still important nonetheless. Whereas in these cases here, you usually reserve these for just the tier 3 assets, just the really, really replicated ones. These ones can be applied to your tier 1, 2, and 3. An example I like to show here is this little scene I found on ArtStation of some fishing props from Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And I want to direct your attention to what I think is octopus. Now, we have different kinds of octopus. We have singular tentacles that are hanging on ropes. We have some that are laid out flat here, some that are a little bit spread out. We have really, really large ones in a pile. And what this shows is that well, it looks like what you would expect a fishing stand to look like, because fish is typically prepared in lots of different ways. So having different variations of the same kind of model can go a long, long way. It would look a little bit weird if every single piece of octopus looked the exact same. You want them to be able to be transferred to different sections, like poking out of a barrel or being hung to dry, like I previously mentioned. But it also can be used for things like windows. This is like an actual image, it's not from a game. But having a set of windows that are broken, some that are still whole, some with holes or little cracks, can go a long way into making your environment feel less copy and pasted. So those are some very quick tips to get as much mileage out of as you can out of your models. So now that I've explained the theory and some tips in regards to how I create the assets for my game environment, now we're going to go into the actual praxis of placing them and turning an empty room into whatever you want, really. And to start, I have taken an example from my own game, Cookies. This right here is going to show an iterative process in which I add props over multiple instances. It's what I call prop layers. And hopefully, by explaining this breakdown, the idea of making a room as detailed and lived in as possible won't sound as daunting. Because I know from looking at the screenshot at least, there's a lot going on. It's pretty messy. But it's just something you have to take step by step, and you'll get a nice looking environment in no time. It just takes a little bit of thought and a little bit of patience. So, some background, this was the very first room I developed for the game. After I got the prototype of walking around and clicking left click to interact with all kinds of objects and getting the aesthetics down, I got to work on creating the first room and developing a workflow so that I knew how exactly I would hmm, determine a feeling for the rooms. I needed to know how I would make rooms look messy and feel as believable as I wanted to. So I started with just an empty room with several dirty walls and a cold tile floor. Now we'll now begin the actual process. So the first layer, this is the layer that incorporates your tier 1 assets. In this case, I have tables, uh, kitchen appliances, a couch, a TV, and some shelves. Just the very, very basic stuff that you would expect from any livable apartment. Again, this isn't pretty, and hopefully, if you walked into an apartment room, there would be more than this. But these are the bare necessities, so that you don't starve and can sleep somewhere. I will note that when it comes to the first layer, not only are you incorporating the basic assets, but you are essentially setting the stage for the layout of your room. This is important because even though the level is going to get much more populated and a little bit more dense, the placement of these props determines how your player can maneuver through it. In this case, even though the floor will be much more busy in the next layers, by placing these props, I have ensured that the player can walk around the kitchen, he can walk in front of the TV, he can walk behind the couch, and there is a space for him to walk to his bedroom, which is off screen. So even though it's kind of dull looking, the placement of these props still requires a little bit of thought. Because while you're always able to move things around afterwards, it can be a bit of a pain. Once you are happy with your tier 1 assets, it is time to begin the incorporation of your tier 2 assets. These are just the props, again, that are a little bit more distinct, that are made to personalize your space a little bit more and complement the props that you have. Some examples include this American flag that's hanging on the wall, a deer head hanging over the TV, a dead fake houseplant, an aquarium, some kitchen appliances such as a toaster and microwave, and some chairs and a radiator. Again, it's still a little too sparse for my liking, but it does feel a little bit more like someone actually moved in here and it isn't just someone who was evicted. So we're on the right track. Next, we begin with adding some tier 3 assets finally. Tier 3 assets can include, in my case, things like garbage on the floor, trash bags, recycling bins, paint cans, bleach, um, milk crates. As you can see, I've left the tables and the countertop bare. This is because while we have begun working on applying our tier 3 assets to our environment, it's better to work in like different instances of Y values. And what I mean by that is to not overwhelm yourself, start just by placing things on the floor to complement the props you have. Then when you are happy, you can then move forward and start populating the tables, the couches, the countertops, just so that it's a lot more organized. And again, you don't get too lost in all of the props that you're placing. So right now, I'm happy with how this looks. It's not just two boxes and a TV. It's now paint cans and a bleach canister and some 2x4s and crates lying about, which is a little bit more apt for a setting like this in which someone is really shady and frankly doesn't take care of themselves all that well. But we can go even deeper. Now we begin including a few more tier 3 assets, specifically on higher surfaces, such as the coffee table, the kitchen counter, and even a little bit on the kitchen table here. These are the really, really replicated assets that are completely at home and being replicated. Things like beer bottles, garbage, napkins. The character in question here is a bit of a drunk. So obviously, having numerous beer bottles littered about is totally appropriate. In fact, it'd be kind of odd if there was just a single beer bottle somewhere. That's not really how this character would roll. On top of that, I am going to introduce what I consider a sub layer. Now, if we take a look at the kitchen countertop here, there's a lot going on. We have Chinese boxes, burger boxes, um, kind of hard to see, but there's also some fast food drinks, really greasy bags, plates, napkins, and this looks really, really good, but it can be a little bit daunting if you're not really sure how to totally fill up a space like a kitchen counter, which is why I recommend working in quote unquote sub layers. Once you've decided what kind of assets you want to have on a kitchen counter, for example, in my case, it was all food related, start by placing just one kind of asset on the counter. At first, I started with the really greasy paper bags because they were a bit larger than all the other food assets. And I placed one, two, three right there. Afterwards, I then started to place the burger boxes and I dotted them around the paper bags. And I figured, yeah, that's good. Afterwards, I took the Chinese delivery boxes and placed them where I felt were just a little bit empty. And same thing with the drinks. And then lastly, I placed some napkins below all of the other assets here. So again, it was like a sub iterative process in which I just took this huge chunk of assets one step at a time to create a very messy but fitting kitchen counter. And then lastly, this is where the room gets tied completely together. We add what are called billboards. This is a type of asset that I have not mentioned, but is very, very common in game development. A billboard is essentially a 3D, 2D object, which sounds like an oxymoron. But what I mean by that is it's not a sprite, but rather just a flat 3D plane that serves as, I don't know, a 3D asset, but it's pretend. It's for things that don't really need to be 3D if you can help it. Things like, in this case, a crushed soda can, tissues on the ground, even things like railings on a stair. Sometimes they're just flat images, chain link fences, what have you. Things like that. They're very, very, very easy on performance since they're usually just one or two polygons, and you can just go crazy with them. In my case, I placed uh, garbage and pieces of paper all over the floor, which really, really ties things together when you compare it to this image here. And I even took the time to place some graffiti on the walls as well, which is again typically just a billboard, which really ties the walls together. And though this may not work in most game instances, it works in mine because it's the PlayStation inspired. I even took a PNG of a hole in drywall and I placed it right here and here as well, just to give that effect. And yeah, billboards can go a very long way to tying everything in your environment together. So that is usually considered the final step. And with that iterative process, I was able to create a really dingy bedroom where a rather unscrupulous person lives. So hopefully that process kind of illustrates how to tackle an environment because even in AAA, they never go all out right out of the gate in decorating. Just like how if you move into an apartment, you don't do all the little tiny details. You unpack all the big things and then you unpack all the tiny things and you move them around where appropriate. It's the same thing here essentially. So now I'm going to go into very quick detail about when and where to add detail because while it's tempting now that you have your props and you want to go into your environment and place things everywhere, there is a bit of tact to it. I find that if you're not at least a little bit methodical with where you place props, your environment ends up looking more like a pawn shop in which there's just all kinds of things like all over the place, just lining every single square inch of your room, as opposed to a section that people live in or do things in. Negative space is appropriate. I mentioned it in the very first slide for the prop layers here, but you do want to have some empty space. Even as I add more props to this bedroom here, or not bedroom, but apartment, there's still like pockets of air, I guess, or space where there's just nothing. There's things on the floor, perhaps, but you can still walk around. And that's important in games as well. If we take a look at this bedroom and what remains of Edith Finch, the walls are pretty much packed, but there's a lot of empty space here, save for the rug. And that makes sense because if you're a person who wants to be able to walk through a bedroom, you want to have a bit of empty space. It seems a little bit obvious, but it's still something to keep in mind because, again, if there was just all kinds of stuff here, unless the character was a hoarder, it would just be a bit weird, in my opinion. You can take a look at Deus Ex as well. It balances busier sections with emptier sections to contrast each other, not just with the floor that is relatively cleaner than the desk, but even just the desk itself. There's a little pocket of desk space here that is relatively empty compared to the parts of the desk where it's covered in books and paper. It would look a bit weird, in my opinion, if every single square inch of the desk was coated in papers. Like even messy people have their own way of organizing things. It may not be effective, but regardless, you want to reflect that when it comes to making a very busy environment like that. And lastly, asymmetry on a small scale is important. When it comes to really epic sections in a game, such as a huge chapel or a ginormous tower, things like symmetry are important. It makes a statement. I don't think it's necessary to make a really grand cathedral be asymmetrical and having like part of it destroyed on one side or missing shingles. If you want to, that's totally fine, but at least on a small scale, that is a much more easy way to apply asymmetry. If we take a look at this alley from Half-Life Alyx as an example, the buildings, they look okay for the most part, but it's the little details. On some sides of the alley, we have props strewn about. On some sides, we have nothing, and that just makes a little bit more sense. If you were to step into an actual alleyway, there's always going to be a bit of neglected space. Honestly, if there was just bricks lining all the sides of the buildings here, it would look a little bit uncanny. So it's important to know when it's okay to make things look symmetrical and when you want to add a little bit of variation. And I guess the one bullet point I missed was heavy and sparse prop placement is important to avoid repetition. Uh, if you take a look at Gone Home, for example, there are a lot more props that are concentrated on the bookshelves, for example, as opposed to the couch, because people sit on the couch, obviously. And same thing on the floor. There are some props, such as well, the table and the rug, but again, you don't really want to draw too much attention to the floor. It's more to the walls. If this entire floor was packed with props, you probably wouldn't notice what's on the shelf as much. So it's a balancing act, is essentially what I am trying to say. On top of that, imperfections are incredibly important because humans inherently are imperfect. It's very uncanny to walk into a game environment and see everything lined up perfectly because it just doesn't really happen. In some instances, it can work. Like if you're trying to go for a futuristic environment where things are super clean or are run by an AI, like in 2001 A Space Odyssey, for example, it's appropriate. But in a lot of instances where it's a setting where humans live, it just doesn't make much sense to make things perfect. You want to make things a little bit off because we as humans leave traces of some sort whenever we inhabit spaces. Imperfections can include things like things that are, I don't know, broken slightly, things that don't work entirely, such as this one light fixture being slightly offset in Soma, or the chairs being just a little bit rotated here. It implies things like character interactions, environmental decay, story elements. It shows that, yes, people were here, which is incredibly important. On top of that, it also avoids your environments looking copy and pasted and disrupts the pattern recognition that is in our brain. Uh, though I can't speak for the game right now because we're not seeing it like this. If this image was every single chair spaced perfectly away from each other, like in the same intervals, and they were all facing straight 100%, you would probably notice because that's just kind of weird. On top of that, it would look like you just copy and pasted a row of chairs and copy and pasted that row 5 or so times, which is not what you want. And on top of that, lastly, by having slight imperfections, it reflects the real life counterparts of our environments better. In this case, Resident Evil 7, or 8, sorry. While I have never been to a rural village in Romania, I can imagine that they're probably not like in super, super tip top shape in the inside of the houses. Um, and that makes sense because that's just how things are in rural farm settings from my experience. So you have things like counters that, or like the pull handles for counters falling off, things like tablecloths bunched up a bit, certain mugs or things have fallen over because it just makes sense. Again, if everything was super clean, it would actually stand out to us much more than if it was just placed casually like you would expect. So the final technique I will go into before I veer towards the conclusion is what I call an asset bouquet. Again, not an actual term, so don't bother searching it up. But essentially, what an asset bouquet is a pre made bundle of tier 3 assets that you can very easily mix and match. They're not that hard to assemble and make filling flat spaces much more easier, in my opinion at least. In the case of cookies, there was one room that was host to a gun nut slash terrorist slash conspiracy theorist, and I wanted that to be known when you walk in to his room. So the player walks in and he sees these tables filled with all kinds of weird ingredients, weaponry, blueprints, and all that. And while the existence of the props themselves conveyed that yeah, he's making bombs and is up to no good. It was the organization and the placement that I find really drives that point home. Because let's face it, if you're the kind of person to like hole up in your apartment and make a makeshift bombs, you're probably not super clean and organized. You're probably a bit scatterbrained. And I wanted that to be reflected. So in these two examples here, I took numerous assets like hydrochloric acid, turpentine, different powders, even a couple beer bottles and grenades, and I just put them together, almost like I was creating a nice centerpiece. And with that, I saved it as like one single object, and I placed it along the tables. And just like that, it looked more like a believable table with someone who went through the time of purchasing bomb ingredients and scattering them all across the table. To further the example here, I then took out a few of the assets from this one and replaced them with other variations, things like zinc powder, shotgun shells, a shotgun itself, and I had a whole new set of assets that was fairly uh, distinct compared to this one, but still hit home the idea that, yeah, this guy is a bit nuts. And I've done that with all kinds of environments in this game, which I will show in the next slide. So all of the techniques that I had explained in the prior slides were put to great use in my game environments. Again, the apartment building in Florida that the game takes place in is squalid for the most part. It's messy, it's neglected, and filled with some very unsavory people. And I wanted that to be made very apparent. You can see some asset bouquets in great use in this kitchen, for example, at the back of a fried chicken restaurant. I have lots of different sauce bottles, breadcrumbs, bags of flour, sacks of potatoes, and you can see I just kind of mix and match them. I have some ketchup bottles and some salt, plus some boxes, and in another section of the shelf I have breadcrumbs and potatoes and sacks of flour. And then in this section, I have just pots, which is totally different than these other two bundles, but is still thematically appropriate, so it just makes sense. And I was able to take this huge empty space in my kitchen, and with about 10 or so different props, was able to fill it up quite easily. Same thing here, for example. Had asset bouquets on a much larger scale for the hallways in the apartment that usually consisted of cardboard boxes, garbage bags, chairs, milk crates, and then one or two distinct items like maybe a boombox or a TV that somebody threw out. And you can even see I've got billboards that I mentioned before that decorate the floor here. And yeah, those were essentially the techniques that I used to make my spaces feel a little bit more lived in and more believable. Even though the art style and usually the premises of the rooms wasn't all that realistic, it still felt like they had a life and that these people existed and did things outside of the player playing the game. And the reason why I keep on driving home the fact that it is a PlayStation 1 styled game, but it's not that important, is because regardless of your art style, I mean, I already said this before, but that has a very, very small effect on how your game looks environmentally. No matter what the art style is, you can create some incredibly engaging game environments if you just put a little bit of time into thinking about how you're going to craft your digital space. Untitled Goose Game is a very, very simple looking game. Uh, the assets themselves are fairly simple, and most of the textures consist of solid colors. But you can see there's a nice layout here. There's tons of variety in the props, lots of proper placement. I'm not quite sure what the context of this screenshot is. It looks like a market of sorts, but it looks the part because there was some care and thought put into where things are placed and how they would replicate the look of a market. Same thing with Sludge Life, who's also developed by the guy who made High Hell. Again, a very simple game, but with just the proper placement of things like computer screens, cigarettes. It made the little environments that you go through in that game very, very believable. Same thing with Genesis Noir. This is a fairly unique art style that doesn't even consist of that many colors. But again, some nice attention to detail tells quite a lot in this narrative game. I can't say like I know the context of this scene specifically because I haven't played it, but I can tell that if you were to take a bit of time to look around in this environment, you would probably learn something about someone because there's details that are just begging to be inspected there. And lastly, a personal game of mine, even though it's very clearly a game from 2004 and the props are very, very simple. Again, just the time and dedication that was taken to dot the levels of Katamari Damacy make the game much more engaging to actually explore and immerse yourself in as you roll things up into a ginormous ball. So, if there's one thing to take away from this, aside from how to create engaging and properly decorated game environments, is that um, you should never feel like you're being held down by the choices you made aesthetically, because very rarely will it ever affect how a game looks if you play to its strengths. And just some reflecting on how that worked out for me. This is the part where I get to brag. I'd say that the interior decorating and cookies turned out really, really well. While people didn't really object to the simple gameplay mechanics, they really, really liked the detail and the character that the game brought. Not just in the NPCs, but the building itself, how it was host to so many different kinds of environments that really told a story even without that much dialogue. Because I mean there are people that talk to you, but I wanted a lot of the characters in this game to be displayed through the circumstances they find themselves in. And I think that the time and care I took into crafting each little room in this game paid off. um, I was reviewed quite well by a horror game site DreadXP. I even got a Game of the Year shout out in a publication by Slant Magazine, and was also featured by PC Gamer. So, if you had any doubts prior to this slide about how effective my thoughts on decorating a game can be, uh, here's some oh, proof, I guess, that it can work. I'm not going to say that everything I said here is gospel. Some things do work better for others, but I'd say that this kind of workflow has served me well and will hopefully continue to serve me well. So now that that is out of the way, we're going to move on to the conclusion by just going over what I learned, what I spoke about very quickly. So we talked a little bit about myself, of course. We talked a little bit about what goes into creating a game environment, what it means to be an environment artist, and what entails the decoration of an interior space, and all the different techniques that are applied to games, no matter the background, no matter the team size, the budget, the art inspirations. A lot of these things are transferable. Whether you're making a really gritty game like Arkham Knight, it will still call for the use of billboards that you can see on the ground here. The inclusion of things like negative space and balancing when to create busy sections of an environment, or rather clean ones like in Alien Isolation. The emphasis on imperfection, such as in Bioshock's Rapture, to convey the idea that yes, this underwater city is old and neglected and falling apart, or in something like Going Under, in which they are trying to replicate the aesthetic and environment of a tech startup that goes very, very poorly. Uh, all of these can be applied to basically any kind of game you want. It's not so much about the game you're making, but rather how you want your game environment to look and how you choose to employ these tools. So hopefully, going forward, whether you have aspirations to make a super realistic 3D game, a hyper stylized, indie style 2D game, or anything in between, hopefully some of the design processes I went over could serve to help you. And for that, like as far as like content goes, that's basically it for me. I've wrapped up this presentation, well, almost on time. But if you have any questions, now's the time for them. But I will say that if you do want to reach out to me, or if you're interested in my work, all of the things that are playable that I've made can be found on my itch account, specifically stef-pinto.itch.io. I can also be reached at on Twitter at stefpintogd with underscores in between each word. There I post, screenshots of things I'm working on. So if you think that's cool, feel free to send me a follow or not. No, it's up to you. But yeah, those are two ways that you can reach out to me and you know see what I'm working on if you're interested. But otherwise, that's it. So thanks for having me, Curious. It was a pleasure putting this together and experiencing presenting a workshop for the first time. And if you have any questions about my experiences as a game dev, or would like some clarification on anything, now is the time to ask.